flamenco performance tonight. The performance requires that there be 20 people. So they are looking for more people who would like to come. It's at 10:30 tonight, right near here. And if you would like to come, then you need to speak to Lubna, who will be standing in the next to the ceramics store at the end of the conference today, just to see if there are 20 of you to make this performance go forward. It's an optional, it's just something some of the people here would like to do. Let me also welcome you back to the last of our 4 sessions today. We have one speaker, and then all of the speakers who've spoken today and Jonathan Bloom will all come up, and we'll have a panel discussion or a group discussion if anyone has questions that should be addressed to the group. And let me now introduce to you this afternoon's introducer, Jeza Arayoshu, who will be introducing this afternoon's speaker.
The primacy Islam accorded to the written word is the reason for the extraordinary significance of the arts of the book in Islamic art. Our next speaker, Dr. MARIANNA SHREVE Simpson, is a recognized expert in this area, in which she has extensively published, taught, and lectured. Dr. Simpson obtained her doctorate from Harvard University in 1978 and has been an influential figure at many distinguished institutions. It is with great pleasure that I present to you Dr. Simpson, who will share with us today her ongoing research on the color red in the history of Islamic art. Please let's welcome Dr. Simpson.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon. Muy buenas tardes. My presentation this afternoon is an initial and tentative attempt to understand the origins, application, and significance of the color red in the history and material culture of the Islamic world, particularly, as my subtitle indicates, within Arabic, Persian, and Turkish artistic traditions. And I'll be dealing with those traditions in a broad historical context, but stopping short of the modern era. And I should also say that much of what I've prepared for presentation has already been anticipated by some of the previous speakers. So there'll be a little bit of haven't I heard this before? Déjà entendu, maybe we call it. I am sure that many of you will have recognized that the first part of my title is adopted from that of the intriguing novel by the Turkish author and Nobel laureate Orhan Pamuk. Originally published as Benim Adım Kırmızı and translated into Spanish as Mi Ojo Rojo, My Name is Red is set in late 16th century Istanbul and involves a group of royal Ottoman painters who are illustrating a special manuscript for the Sultan Murad III in Frankish, that means European, style. The novel begins with the murder of one of the miniaturists who objects to the project's unprecedented stylistic approach and proceeds via a long and convoluted plot to the identification of the murderer, who was one of the other painters, through the verve with which he depicts a particular horse. For anyone interested in Islamic art, and particularly anyone who studies Persian and Turkish illustrated manuscripts, part of the appeal of My Name is Red comes from its recurring allusions to and descriptions, often with many liberties taken, of compositions in such well-known volumes as the Great Mongol Shahnameh on the right, the Tahmas Shahnameh on the right, the Surnameh of Murad III, and the binding on the right is from another manuscript made for Murad III, and the Haftarang made for Sultan Ibrahim Mirza, otherwise known as the Freer Jami, which we've already seen a little bit of in the earlier paper. Pamuk drew on this particular manuscript, the Freer Jami, for much of the imagery in his novel, My Name is Red, and in fact, the horse on the left is the one that the murderer in his novel painted, or at least it's the horse that Pamuk was looking at and thinking about when he described the horse that the murderer painted. So in addition to being a murder mystery, the novel is an Islamic art historical treasure hunt. Meanwhile, much of the book's narrative complexity is due to the multiplicity of its characters, some of which have proper names or specific identities, others the name of animate or inanimate objects, and still others the name of colors, all of which do double duty as the succinct titles of the book's 59 chapters and as their first-person narrators. Curiously, given the title of the novel itself, only one of its chapters features a character named Red. And this chapter, which is number 31, so sort of midway through the story, is also unique in starting off with several long paragraphs in which Red, as narrator, describes his, or maybe hers, appearance in both specific and generic paintings and other artistic productions. And here are a few excerpts from this soliloquy with the appropriate, the very specific illustrations that Red is describing, I'm showing you here. I was there, says Red, on Rustam's quiver when he traveled far and wide in search of his missing steed, on the left. I was on the outfit of the striking maiden that Bahram Gur visited on a Tuesday, on the right. I emerged as Alexander's lifeblood shimmered brightly from his handsome nose after he suffered sunstroke. Pamuk was apparently looking at this illustration in the Freer Jami. He didn't seem to notice, however, that in fact there's no blood coming from Iskandar's nose. I embellished ushak carpets and blouses worn by stunning maidens with outstretched necks, watching through the street through open shutters, like this image of Zuleika in the Freer Jami. I love, says Red, illuminating the wings of angels, as here in the upper left, the lips of maidens, the death wounds of corpses, and severed heads bespeckled with blood. This lengthy itemization is then followed by a question that gets right to the heart of the matter, and indeed to the point of this symposium. What, says the character Red, does it mean to be a color? He then proceeds to answer that rhetorical question in one stunning sentence. Color is the touch of the eye, music to the deaf, a word out of darkness. Then Red quickly turns self-referential and self-congratulatory. I am so fortunate to be Red. I am fiery. I am strong. I know men take notice of me and that I cannot be resisted. We will return to Red's strength, attraction, and desirability in due course. For the moment, however, I want to expand briefly on what Pamuk has signaled about the color's universality and ubiquity, first as a broad cultural construct and then as a particular visual phenomenon in Islamic art. In English, or in this group I should say in American English, we roll out the red carpet and paint the town red on celebratory occasions. We get caught red-handed when snitching from the cookie jar, and we get tangled in red tape, made from safflower, as we know, when dealing with government bureaucracies. We turn beet red when we are embarrassed, just as here in Spain, se pone rojo como un tomate, from shame or embarrassment. While in Turkey, people turn red, kızarmak, when they blush, an expression that is also associated with roasting, and become raving red, kızıldili, when they are mad. Americans also see red when enraged. A similar Arabic expression for being angry has it literally, his eye got red. In Syria, the same expression signifies a cruel person, and in Iran, executioners. Cruelty and perversion is similarly reflected in the early modern Spanish refrain, cabeza bermeja, alma perversa. A bermejo, or red-headed person in 16th and 17th century Spain, certainly was not trustworthy, as we can infer from a long anecdote involving a king of Granada named Bermejo, included in the 1610 Tesoro de la Lengua Castellana. Many such red expressions or associations worldwide relate to or come from blood, which as far as I know is always red, unless you happen to be aristocratic and then maybe your blood is blue, and which in turn naturally conjures up violence, war, bloodshed, martyrdom, patriotism. Jonathan Bloom showed us last night many flags, which include red, and of course death. On the other hand, to call someone sohru, or reddish face in Iran, means that a person is proud, prosperous, and happy. Traditional Turkish brides wear red, not white, and later we will see the same association in classical Persian painting. And again, of course, there's a definite blood association here. Something that is highly embellished or gaudy in Turkish is said to be literally with red and roses or with red and sequins, and someone who is trying to be visible, to appear at the center of things, in other words, to show off or be a show off, is described as wearing red. Well, we could go on and on here, but I think the point is obvious. Red abounds in many different figures of speech and social customs, and with both positive and negative associations worldwide. Now, we could do a similar overview of the many and varied types of traditional Islamic art involving red. In the interest of time, I'm just going to show a very small selection, starting with, oh, darn, I meant to show this to you before when I was talking about expressions in red. Some of you will recognize it from John Cage's book on color and culture, in which this red disc is the same exercise and after imagery that John Thompson showed us earlier. So, just a selection of objects, starting with the earliest surviving manuscripts of the Quran, which typically have red orthographic signs. That is, red ink is used to mark the vowels, as we see on these leaves in Kufic script from the 8th and 9th centuries. Red is also regularly used within marginal medallions that count Quran verses, and that, as here, and that indicate the places for prostration, often beautifully combined with gold. And red serves in many Islamic manuscripts of many different types and many different periods as the common color for rubrics or text headings. That's a practice that goes back to antiquity. For keywords and phrases, for the ruled lines that enframe the written surface, and for diagrams in scientific manuscripts, as in this copy of Euclid's Book of Elements dated 1188. Early Islamic ceramics and glass invariably feature red. Indeed, red creates the dominant coloristic effect on the rare polychrome lusterware and enameled glass, such as these, produced in Arab lands during the 8th and 9th centuries. The glass on the lower right, you're probably familiar with, it's in the Metropolitan Museum. The sherd on the upper left belongs to the Freer Gallery in Washington. I don't believe it's ever been published, but it's a beautiful example of the use of red in early lusterware, and the original bowl must have been spectacular. Red is also a regular part of the palette on underglazed slip-painted wares made in northeastern Iran and Central Asia during the 9th and 10th centuries. And with these slip-painted pieces, it is noteworthy that the white, black, and red color scheme replicates that of early manuscripts. And later we'll see why, optically and linguistically speaking, this combination may not have been simply for visual effect. Red continues to star on medieval and early modern ceramics and glass, such as this well-known Mamluk beaker in Baltimore and this eye-catching Ottoman jug in Copenhagen. It appears too, I'm doing this rapidly, on early and medieval metal vessels in the form of copper inlays, as on this jug, again in Baltimore, and on the famous Bobrinsky bucket in the Hermitage of 1163, in which copper inlay contrasts with the metal itself. And throughout the centuries, red has been a dominant and often the predominant color on Islamic textiles and carpets, as we see on these examples, the famous Saint-Josse silk, datable before 963 on your left, this hanging also silk from 13th century Spain on the right, Persian velvet on the right from the time of Shah Abbas, a tent hanging from Mughal India on the left, and finally this sumptuous kaftan said to have been worn by the Ottoman Sultan Selim I. Red also flashes and glows from innumerable pieces of Islamic jewelry and other precious objects studded with rubies. And of course, it shows up and off in architecture, as at the Alhambra. The name's probably a corruption from the Arabic Kalat Alhambra, or Red Castle. And at the royal complexes in Delhi and Agra. The upper right is Delhi. Jonathan Bloom showed us Agra last night. And of course, on the interior of buildings, as just next door, across the way. So all these buildings, because of the distinctive color of their stone masonry. Finally, and returning to the Islamic arts of the book, red was also a favorite color for the decoration of manuscripts, including their illumination, illustration, and binding. As we see on these 15th century examples, on the top, the illuminated frontispiece on the opening pages of a manuscript made in Cairo around 1470 for the Mamluk ruler Qaitbay, and below the pictorial frontispiece and the inner cover or doublure of two equally splendid volumes made in Herat for the Timurid Prince Bayezid around 1429 and 1430, respectively. And I hope that these images look sharper to you in the audience than they do to me up here. They look fuzzy, are they? Are they all right? Good, great, thank you. So in short, there is hardly an Islamic artistic medium in which the color red does not appear. No surprise. Later, we will look at the artistic, or more exactly, the aesthetic functions that red plays in these and other works of art, with particular attention to those media where the colorant is applied as a dye, a pigment, a dye, or a lake. And I don't think we have to go into any further explanation of those distinctions after the previous presentations. But before we get to that, I just want to mention one other fundamental aspect of red, that the works of art that we've just seen, and here I wanted to show you something else, yes, example of red pigment, an example of red dye. I want to mention just one other fundamental aspect of red that the works of art we've just seen bring to mind, and that we all know intuitively, but may not spend a lot of time worrying about in the course of our everyday activities. Namely, that this color varies according to hue, value, and chroma. We know that from, we've heard that several times already in the last day and a half, and has many different shades or tones, each with its own distinctive name. And these are samples of red made from carmine, which I'll talk about in a moment. In English, for instance, we distinguish between crimson, scarlet, vermilion, ruby, rose, fuchsia, and burgundy, not to mention pink, cranberry, tomato red, fire engine red, coral, terracotta, and so on. In Spanish, there is rojo, carmesí, escarlata, colorado, bermejo, bermellón, which I think is archaic, ruby, tinto, which is what is usually used to describe red wine, although it's negra in Catalan, rosa, rosado, rosa bebé, rosa clavil, and so forth. A similarly rich lexicon of reds exists in Arabic. In addition to Amr, the most usual word, there are some 50 other Arabic words for red, and plus others that denote the color's various mixtures and blends. Certain Arabic words have been identified as the etymological origins of their Spanish and English equivalents, notably kirmez for carmesí and crimson, and siklat for escarlata and scarlet. My point here is as much a perceptual as a linguistic one. While we all may acknowledge the existence of diverse reds and may even refer to them in conversation, we might be hard-pressed to find their exact correspondence in the material world and or to make the correspondences in a consistent fashion. For instance, I'm comfortable in describing the robe of this Mughal Indian painter as red and the delicate blossoms in the hand of the Safavid Persian maiden as pink. But I have no idea whether contemporary viewers would have called the painter's robe sork, which is the common Persian word for this color and used in Mughal India, and the young lady's flowers gulgun, meaning rose, or al, meaning light red, or arusak, meaning baby doll red. Furthermore, since, again, and what I'm about to say is something we've heard already, since the color of an object is determined by the light that it both reflects and emits, and by the way the receptors in our eyes receive and respond to that light's dominant wavelength, luminosity and purity, my jacket's particular shade of red would doubtless look different to us, and that's perhaps require a different descriptor, outside in the bright Cordovan sunshine than here in the artificial light of this lecture hall. And by the way, again, this is something we've heard, of all the colors in the spectrum, red has the longest discernible light wavelength, which is why it elicits the strongest optical reaction of all colors, and is one reason why the matador carries a scarlet muleta in the bullfight's final stage. It's the combination of the color's long wavelengths and the cloth's movement that attracts the animal's attention. While red's varied vocabulary, what the linguist John Lyons has called its lexicalization or lexical encoding, invariably leads us into the rarefied realm of color perception theories, it also brings us to another, much more concrete aspect of this ubiquitous color, namely the actual physical origins of red pigments and red dyes throughout the history of Islamic art. On this topic, there's a great deal of information available, thanks to Arabic and Persian treatises written as long ago as the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, as well as technical studies of much more recent vintage. And we could spend days reviewing the medieval Islamic literature alone. Suffice it to say that the red colorant comes from a variety of synthetic and natural sources, including animal, vegetable, and mineral, and it is the specific ingredients and the preparation of those ingredients that determine the difference between, for instance, this orange-red robe as painted in 16th century Iran and this crimson one as woven in 16th or 17th century Turkey. And we'll take these two works of art as initial points of departure for a brief foray into the material origins and production of red. This attractive youth, usually called a prince, was created around 1550 by the Persian painter Muhammad Haravi, whose name appears at the lower edge of the composition. The artist used many different pigments to paint the picture, including the red lead for the prince's underrobe. His painting belongs today in the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington and has been tested there by the museum's conservation and scientific staff, which is one good reason for using it as an example today. So red lead, also called red lead oxide, has the same chemical and crystalline structure as the mineral minium, which was, however, used only as a pigment in Greco-Roman times, if at all. Someone doubtless will correct me on that if I'm wrong. And by the way, the Latin name minium is the origin of the word miniature, originally meaning to paint in red. By the time Muhammad Haravi sat down to paint his prince, red lead had long been available as an artificial pigment, made by heating or roasting lead white at extremely high temperatures, a process that results in particles that are red to orange in transmitted light. The batch of red lead-based pigment that Muhammad Haravi used for the prince's robe, as well as for the robe of the woman on his knee there, was obviously more on the orange end of the spectrum, which is considered the purest red pigment, chemically speaking, because it has the fewest impurities. Already in 9th century Baghdad, the eminent physician and alchemist Al-Ghazi recognized minium or red lead as an artificially prepared substance. In the early 11th century, Muiz ibn Badis, a princely patron of the arts in modern-day Tunisia, who wrote a very important treatise on the arts and crafts of bookmaking, includes red lead as an ingredient in inks for calligraphy and dyes for leather bindings, an ingredient for ink in calligraphy and dyes for leather bindings, such as these. So the red vocalization dots are very probably red lead, and as is this binding, although I grant you it looks more brown than red. By the early Safavid period, when Muhammad Haravi was at work, and when for a time the great master Behzad, to whom is ascribed this painting with a young man in a beautiful red robe, was head of the Royal Library and Studio, various recipes for red lead were available, of which one, compiled by a fellow artist named Sadiki Bey, begins with a warning that, quote, "What is involved is not wholly without its dangers." And that's because lead poisoning was then, as it is still nowadays, a notorious hazard. And then he goes on with detailed instructions, which I'm going to condense, for heating, dissolving, and cooling the lead, then washing it several times, mixing it with sal ammoniac, pounding it repeatedly and energetically, then roasting and washing it yet again, until, Sadiki Bey tells us, red lead should have formed, strong and pure. This last comment, giving the red pigment properties or attributes, is typical of the metaphorical language so often found in treatises on color making, and relates directly to the use of colors, including red, as a metaphor in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish cultures, a subject that we'll get to anon. Meanwhile, we now have red lead, a dense and finely textured pigment, that was used as an ink and as a paint by Islamic artists throughout the centuries, including to color paper. And this is a 14th century Nasrid Spanish letter written on pinkish paper, and this well-known illustration with a detail here of paper, I can't use the word dyeing probably, paper coloring down below, dipping the sheets of paper into a vat of diluted pigment, I hope it's what it was, and hanging on the line to dry. So the kind of testing done on Muhammad Haravi's prints at the Freer also reveals that red lead was often used together with and sometimes over vermilion, another red pigment. And for instance, on these paintings, this one from the Great Mughal Shahnameh of 1325 or so, the red bricks are red lead, but King Zav's robe is vermilion. And here on a 16th century Bukharan illustration, the little carpet here is vermilion, and This figure is red lead. Also called cinnabar in English, cinabrio in Spanish, and zanjar in Arabic, vermilion is a dense red mineral found in mines in Asia, in the Altai, and Russian Turkestan, with the most famous deposits. Cheryl Porter has already mentioned this, and you saw a sample of it outside. I have one too. Being the Almaden mines of Spain in Ciudad Real, about 125 kilometers from here. The mineral can be used as a pigment, as we have heard earlier, and the chronicle by the well-known early 17th century Persian author and court secretary Ghazi Ahmad describes how cinnabar can be prepared for paint. And these illustrations from the Freer Jami haven't been tested for cinnabar or vermilion, but Ghazi Ahmad wrote a great deal about the patron of this manuscript, so there may be a connection. More typically, however, this pigment with two names, that is vermilion and cinnabar, is based on artificially made mercuric sulfide, created by combining mercury and sulfur in a process that apparently first developed in China early in the Common Era, and then, like many other technological developments, moved westward and into the Islamic world by at least the 8th or 9th century, when the Arab alchemist Jabir mentioned a red compound formed by the union of sulfur and mercury. Once again, the Safavid painter and pigment specialist Sadiki Bey provides a succinct explanation of vermilion's preparation in his day. For this friend, he says, you must take 3 or 4 miscals of mercury, that's about 4¼ grams, plus 3 miscals of sulfur. Pound the mixture in a mortar for something over an hour, and don't be alarmed if it turns darkly ashen in color. The next step is for you to place the mixture in a glazed flask and to keep it on the fire from noon to nightfall. Then let it cool, and then see the brilliant red vermilion that has formed. Interestingly, the word vermilion comes from the Latin vermes, a name that originally designated an insect used for the preparation of red dye. Although it has long been recognized that the pigment vermilion is produced, as Sadiki Bey instructs us, from a synthetic compound of mercury and sulfur and not from an insect, it is also the case that insects were used for the making of red pigment, or more precisely, again, Cheryl Porter, I'm sure will correct me, a form of red lake, and used by Islamic illuminators like an ink for small details within their intricate compositions, as well, or so it seems, by Islamic painters. And this illustration from the 1224 Dioscorides manuscript, this figure here has been tested, it belongs to the Freer, and it's an organic pigment of some unknown origin. Unfortunately, the scientific literature for this particular organic source of red pigment still seems rather limited. On the other hand, there's plenty of information available about the various organic substances used to create red dye stuffs of various grades in the Islamic world. Among those that produced the highest quality red and that were the most sought after for luxury items, such as the silk robes worn by Ottoman sultans, princes, and courtiers. And here's one worn by Selim I that we saw earlier, and a smaller robe worn by Ahmed I as a child, or Ahmed, well, before he became Ahmed I. So the most highest quality sources for red dye stuffs were certain species of aphids or scale insects of the genus Caucus. And we've heard about this also. I'm going to go quickly here. We're talking about small, teeny, weeny, wingless female insects that lived on the roots, stems, and leaves of particular trees and grasses, and that were collected after they had mated and before they had laid their eggs. So these were pregnant coccids. We saw the actual insect itself. Here's a little drawing of one. And it's the multitude of their red eggs, and each female contained thousands, that yielded the particular red colorant known in the scientific literature as carmine after the bugs were killed, dried, and crushed. So I'm going to spare you the details of this harvesting, and especially the post-harvesting process. It's a little grim, except to say that the harvesters traditionally were women who grew their fingernails long so to be able to pick off the small insects. Various species of coccids indigenous to the Near East were used for red dye stuffs, and I just will mention a couple. One of the most sought after came from Armenia and Azerbaijan, and its dye is called Armenian red. It's been traced back to Assyrian times and attested to by numerous Arab and Persian geographers dating from the 9th and 14th centuries. Medieval texts generally refer to the dye as kirmiz or kermez, and the origin of the Spanish carmesí and the English crimson, as I mentioned earlier, and vary between identifying its source as an insect and as a red worm. And the ancient Persian or Pahlavi word for worm was kirm or karmir. Kirm was also the etymological origin of a second dye made from the bodies of yet another cockad. The short name for this one is kermes. This particular species breeds on the scarlet oak trees around many parts of the Mediterranean, including Spain, across the top of the Fertile Crescent and into the Iranian plateau. It appears in many classical texts, Arabic, Hebrew, Greek, Roman, Arab, Persian, also the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. And some of the earliest accounts describe kermes as a berry, a grain, a snail, and a worm, which just adds to the kind of lexical confusion about all this. In this case, the red was a very deep, bright, or scarlet red. It enjoyed its greatest popularity as a dye from the 12th century onwards, and probably was the source for the brilliant red coloring of the mantle of Roger II, 1133 to 34. By the early modern times, however, the appeal of this particular cockad started to be rivaled by that of another called the cochineal, a species that grows on the palms of the nopal prickly cactus in the Mexican highlands, and that was harvested and used there for red colorant long before Columbus discovered the Americas. And here we have a nopalery, it's called, a cactus farm, and a Mexican gentleman holding a cactus leaf with the cochineal on it. So this was exported by the Spanish colonizers and conquistadors from Los Indios, as they called their New World dominions, called it grana cochinilla, grana because the dried insects looked like grain, and cochinilla being a diminutive of coccus or cocchinus, which is the Latin for scarlet. This is exported widely by the early 16th century, including to India, Iran, Turkey, and Italy, particularly Venice, and of course also to Spain. There's a wonderful, those of you interested in this, there's a wonderful book published in 2005 by Amy Butler Greenfield called A Perfect Red. It's about to come out, well, maybe next year in a Spanish edition. And one aspect of the whole story of cochineal, which is fascinating and relevant for our purposes, is that in 1614, the Spanish monarch Philip III sent a diplomatic mission to the Persian Shah Abbas I with his ambassador bearing several hundred gifts, all together totaling 32,000 ducats, which was a lot of money. By far the largest item, the most valuable item in this assemblage of royal presents was 5 barrels of cochineal, described in the Habsburg inventories as worth 4,000 ducats and making the finest crimson color. This particular historical incident does not appear in Greenfield's study, A Perfect Red, but it certainly reinforces her point about the importance of cochineal in early modern international relations and artistic production. And even with all this, believe it or not, we've only begun to scratch the surface of red's history, and there are still other organic substances of which we've heard about a bit already, stick lac, madder, safflower, and even pomegranate blossoms that were known either through scientific testing or historical text to be used for the color red in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish works of art. Indeed, the multiple origins in both natural and synthetic materials, the diverse manufacturing processes, and widespread distribution of red as both a pigment and dye from literally one end of the traditional Islamic world to the other, and all documented in one way or another from the earliest phases of Islamic history to early modern times, speaks to the widespread availability and use, to the profound investment in terms of labor, time, and capital, and to the obvious attraction to and demand for the color red throughout Islamic history. Red thus becomes a compelling case study in the social and economic dynamics of artistic production and patronage, as well as for key developments in Islamic science and technology. The color, or more accurately, the raw materials that create the color, also helps us to appreciate the vast international network of commodity, trade, workshop, and financial relations. This is what Cheryl Porter also discussed, that linked, for instance, the Almaden miners who brought up the cinnabar ore from deep within Al-Andalus, to the women who used their long fingernails to pick off the Kermes insects from oak trees in Azerbaijan, to the merchants who imported these raw materials for processing into Fustat, Aleppo, Bursa, Tabriz, and Delhi, to the calligraphers in Baghdad, the binders in Kairouan, the potters in Nishapur, the painters in Herat, and the silk weavers in Agra, who used the processed pigments and dyes for their creations, such as these, a manuscript illustration from 15th century Herat and a beautiful hanging from late 16th, early 17th century India. And ultimately to the bazaars, madrasas, and palaces of Granada, Cairo, Damascus, Istanbul, Isfahan, and Lahore, where their finished products of all kinds featuring red were sold, bought, and enjoyed. To this intricate network, we must add all those, such as the 11th century Arab prince Ibn Badis and the 16th century Persian painter Sadiqi Bey, who experimented with and recorded recipes for red. In short, the color red constituted a veritable industry with a widespread presence and long-lasting place in Islamic material and cultural history. So now we have red pigment and red dye in the hands, as it were, of the artists and artisans who used it. We need to look at exactly that. What use did they make of red? Or to put this another way, what role does the color red play in artistic creation, and what are the aesthetics of its application? We have seen how in early manuscripts of the Quran, red is used to vocalize the holy text itself, as well as to color marginal medallions and surah dividers. Thus here, red simultaneously marks or defines, as well as draws our attention to, fundamental phonetic and textual elements of the Word of God. The color aids, in other words, in the progression and understanding of both content and calligraphy, a service it provided in manuscripts of all kinds and qualities, religious and secular, luxurious and workaday, throughout the history of the Islamic arts of the book, including, as we've seen, for the rubrics or heading, keywords, and glosses of various manuscripts. Red serves a similar function on slip-painted ceramics from 9th and 10th century Central Asia and northeastern Iran. And to give an example, here is a ceramic bowl in the David collection, discussed most recently by Sheila Blair and Jonathan Bloom in their Cosmophilia exhibition catalog. Its Arabic inscription reads, "He who believes in recompense from God is generous with gifts," a hadith attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. 4 small dots signal the beginning of the tradition here, and the initial letters of each of the words in the inscription are written in red to draw our attention to them. And this is a very good example, but it's not the only example of this kind of artistic practice. And here I want to pause for a moment and pick up a point I mentioned at the very outset about the conjunction of white, black, and red, so common in early Quran manuscripts and on contemporary Iranian pottery. You doubtless know that, along with white and black, red belongs to what is sometimes called the primary color triad or trilogy, and is generally accepted as one of the 3 colors, chromatically in the middle, between light or white and dark and black, that appears universally in almost every sector of humanity and in almost all human languages in the course of their evolution. More particularly, and this according to the groundbreaking studies of the ethnolinguistics of Berlin and Kay, whom Jonathan Bloom referred to yesterday, all languages contain terms, or what are called perceptual color categories, that signify white and black. If a language contains 3 color terms, the third one will be red, always, apparently no exceptions. Red's linguistic prominence is borne out by its frequent reference in classical and medieval philosophical debates on the nature of phenomena such as sight, including those of the Arab writers Al-Tabari and Averroes, as well as in modern-day sensory and perceptual studies concerning the distinction between the quality of an object and the object itself. That is not to say, of course, that the calligrapher of this Quran or the potter of this bowl would have known or even cared about such discourse. I would bet, however, that there was some strong sense born out of artistic experience that deeply saturated red was the most effective visual adjunct to the totally unsaturated white and black. And returning now to how red works in artistic practice, in addition to selectively highlighting key epigraphic features of white and black slip-painted wares, red also sets off the main geometrical and floral elements of their decor. In these pieces, for instance, red enhances the design by seeming to activate or propel the circular movement of the central motifs, as well as to highlight the inscriptions on the rim. Indeed, on the piece on the left, red outlines and thus animates the primary feature of the decor, which is this elegant palmette interlace. Once again, we see how red is what I think of as the design dynamo. Likewise, red's efficacy in setting off designs mean that it was in regular use as a background color, basically as a foil for the principal or primary elements in a work of art, the feature that constitutes the actual subject or content of a composition, as we see on this 13th century Quran, where the lines of writing are encased in red contour panels. About this same time, quite a bright red began to emerge as a common background color in illustrated manuscripts, filling in, as it were, for what previously had been either uncolored ground or gold. Admittedly, such a solid application of red paint, often tomato red in tone, as the ground for narrative action or narrative inaction, as in the case of the frontispiece on the right, seems to have been a rather short-lived artistic practice. Be that as it may, the use of red as a pictorial background in a major bookmaking center like Shiraz in south-central Iran, where the SHREVE manuscript of 1341 on the left and the Khalil-ud-Dimna of 1307 on the right were illustrated, suggests that artists had recognized and understood the color's effectiveness as the backdrop for narrative action. And this may be, as has been suggested, in a continuation of a much older tradition of Central Asian and Iranian wall painting. Islamic textiles also regularly feature red backgrounds, as in this silk fragment from the late 14th or early 15th century Spain in Copenhagen, where an Arabic poem is woven in white against a striking red ground, which was doubtless kermes. Red also serves as the ground for figural imagery in both textiles and carpets, as in the famous 10th century Saint-Gilles fragment with its two impressive elephants, and on this Safavid rug, where pairs of real and mythical figures wrestle on a floral field of red. It is also frequently the color of choice for the central field on Islamic prayer rugs and prayer mats, with their typical architectural elements representing the mihrab niche in a mosque, as in these two examples. And with these works, we enter that ambiguous sphere so often encountered in Islamic art of uncertain spatial relationships, including those of background and foreground, and more specifically here, of how to distinguish and differentiate between spatial planes. On the silk mat, red defines both horizontal and vertical space, the ground for the representations of the prophet's footsteps, and the floor where the worshiper also would stand in prayer, and the backdrop or wall in front of which the columns and arches rise. On the carpet, the color, while physically confined between the prayer niche columns and beneath the arch, again defines the flat space where prayers are performed, and at the same time reads as architectural volume, as well as the space beyond which prayers flow. Red thus becomes the locus of multiple functions, of standing, kneeling, and prostrating, of looking down, through, and beyond, as if in a doorway, as in the mihrab of the great mosque here at Cordoba, for instance, and of praying and sending those prayers through to a still higher sphere. And finally, for a look at how the various functions of red as focus, highlight, animator, and backdrop work together in Islamic art. For this, we may turn most fruitfully to pictorial imagery, and especially to the tradition of manuscript painting as it developed during the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, where we find numerous examples of how red both structures a composition and directs the viewer's eye through that composition, often by its propinquity to other specific colors, particularly blue. And we had a question about that earlier, and I'm not going to get into it either. Maybe we can discuss it in discussion later. Red's dual structural and directional role, though by no means absent from other painting traditions, assumes perhaps even in greater importance within the conceptual framework of classical Islamic miniature painting, where all the components, trees, plants, humans, animals, and so forth, coexist in a hierarchy of visual values determined by the flatness and size of the piece of paper on which they are painted. Examples abound, but we'll confine ourselves to a few, actually maybe just one in the interest of time. I don't know when I started speaking, Jonathan. Oh, right. I'll do one here. An early 15th century copy of one of the 5 poems by Nizami, the great Persian poet whom we've just heard about from Dr. Maisami. This particular narrative illustrated here recounts how the sculptor Farhad visits Queen Shireen in her palace. We enter both painting and palace through the bright red table in the foreground, placed next to a kneeling attendant who wears a slightly paler shade of red for his robe here and a darker color red for his hat, and who offers a platter to his mistress attired in salmon pink. So here there's a triumvirate, a triangle of reds that leads us into the painting and immediately identifies the focus of narrative attention. Farhad, by contrast, is a secondary protagonist. The central unit, defined by reds, is then highlighted on the sides by other touches of red. The robes of the two standing figures at the left, flanking a third man with a red turban cap. No fewer than 5 of the 8 figures on the right wear red, including the woman standing behind the window grill. Up above, red curtains drape across the composition's middle zone, simultaneously framing the windows in pointed arched units and forming a rhythmic pattern, that is to say, activating descending and ascending contours, mimicked by red blossoms that draw together and unites the 3 figure blossom groupings below. These vivid red drapery swags in turn lead up to the flat wall of the pinkish brickwork, similar in tone to Shireen's robe on the lower level. Again, red curtains frame windows, which in turn contribute to the overall symmetry of the composition, and at the same time lead us upwards to the central faceted balcony, essentially a mirador, where each of the 4 figures wears an item of red clothing and where a single red band provides the visual cornice. It might be possible, of course, to analyze the same painting in a very similar way through its use of blue. And indeed, red and blue are in direct relation to each other as pictorial colors and balance each other when placed side by side in a composition, as this one. But red is optically the stronger and warmer of the two. It advances while blue recedes, a characteristic that the painter who designed and executed this charming painting understood full well and exploited in the service of his composition's visual focus, movement, balance, and harmony. In short, the formal attributes that Persian painters of the late 14th and early 15th century, and I would venture to say that Islamic artists throughout the history of Islamic art aim to achieve. I'll end here because I know we want to have time still for discussion, and I can perhaps bring up some other points at that discussion. Thank you very much.